After shooting literally thousands of homes for hundreds of clients over the years, I've found some things that can really help speed up editing real estate photos. I want to share some of those tips and techniques with you in this episode, and this is going to apply to both HDR and to Flambient as well. Now, besides just the tips that I've got in this episode, I've also got other videos here on my YouTube channel on how to speed up Lightroom Classic and also Photoshop from an application perspective. So I have links to those other videos down in the description of this video, as well as some other useful information if you'd like to check that out. But first, let's get the obvious low-hanging fruit out of the way first, and that's when it comes to presets in Lightroom Classic and Photoshop Actions. You're probably already familiar with both, and they are crucial. Indeed they are, but they are just starting points. Now, anything that you do repetitively, that you're gonna do the same thing over and over again on every photo that you're going to edit, then you should have a preset for it in Lightroom Classic and/or an action for it in Photoshop. That will really help speed things up, like applying automatic edits to an image from just a simple preset in Lightroom Classic. And you're likely familiar with my Photoshop actions, like the 50/50 Flambient you've seen me do in other videos as well. And those are all crucial things to have, and they will speed things up. And I've got a variety of videos on that here on my YouTube channel as well. But that's the obvious stuff, and it also, once again, is just for a starting point. It won't edit your image for you. No preset can, no Photoshop action can, and that's why I don't recommend anybody just go out and buy these packs of Lightroom presets. They're just starting points. They're not going to edit every image for you because every image will be a little bit different. Same with Photoshop actions. They can do a lot of repetitive tasks for you, but it won't finish it off. Instead, you'll still have to at some point do some other editing, and that's where a lot of the other tips come in that I want to get to in this episode. So with that out of the way, let's really move on and dig deeper into how you can really speed up editing real estate photos with some lesser known but very powerful techniques. First, if you're doing HDR and you want to do that high-end luminosity masking by loading a channel, there are easy ways to do it. Here's a great example. This was an HDR image, but there's other things in here besides just standard HDR, and they're going to fall into some of the other tips here too that I'm going to share with you in this episode. But this is using that high-end HDR technique you've probably seen me talk about before, and it started out with just a couple of ambient images. Now you can see here that this was a very dark one and this was a very light one. And this is one thing to really speed things up while you're on site and also editing. Don't be bothering with 5 or 7 images to bracket your photos. You really don't need that. These two and basically some other stuff that I'll be showing you here in this episode is all that you need to get this really good high-end HDR photo. Now we're also going to be talking about Flambient, but in this case I used the high-end HDR technique. This was for a commercial shoot and the building was very, very large. And so it was very difficult to get a lot of lighting throughout that. A lot of times I'll carry a flash in my back pocket like an 8200 Pro. In this case, there really wasn't a lot to bounce off of, so I knew that I could pull off a high-end HDR image out of this for this particular image. This is something you can also do for residential real estate, although I do recommend using Flambient when you can. In either case, with just these two exposures, we're able to get this better image blended, but it requires luminosity masking. Now you may be familiar with doing that by going, for instance, to the channels icon, doing a control click on RGB, and selecting then an area of brightness or darkness. I'm going to do Control D. We're not going to do it that way. The fast way though to do this high-end HDR is by auto-loading a channel by doing the keystroke Control Alt 2 or Command Option 2 if you're on a Mac. So having this dark layer over top of this brighter layer, as shown here, all I have to do is on that darker layer on Windows, I'll be doing Control Alt 2. And when I do that, it automatically makes that selection. So I didn't have to go over to channels, I didn't have to do control click on RGB, come back over to layers, just simply Control Alt 2 or Command Option 2 if you're on a Mac. And then I would finish it off. Now I might create myself an action to do this, but basically it's going up to the select menu, going then to modify, and then to feather, and feathering that by about 100 pixels. When you do that, all you need to do next is just apply a layer mask, And you can do that by just clicking this little button down here. Now we have basically a well-blended HDR image. Only took 2 photos to do it. It doesn't have any weird looking shadows or noise in it, but there's a lot of other stuff, as you can see here from other layers, that I did put into it. Now, if you're not familiar with this technique and you want to learn more about it and some of this other stuff that I did on top of this, then you might want to check out my course on expert editing, where I show how to do this technique in great detail. If you're not familiar with that course, I do have a series of courses on real estate photography, and I also have a series of books on real estate photography as well, and I have links to all of that down in the description for this video. But in any case, we can see here that this is a well-blended HDR image, and having a mask, I could still do some touch-ups on it if I want to. I could take this eraser and just erase a little bit more out of here that I want. And the window we're going to cover in the next tip. But here, I've got basically everything done just by using those 2 images, just those 2 exposures, and then that quick luminosity mask trick. Now, the next tip falls in line with getting that window. And the tip is that no matter what, you should probably do darken mode window pulls even if you're shooting HDR. Now, that's what I did for this, and I'm going to get to this in a second, but what I want to show first is, if you're not familiar with a darken mode window pull, let's take a look at this image here. Now, this has got the typical flambient blending. This was a 50-50 flambient where I've got some flash layers and then an ambient over top of it. But what I do in a standard window pull is I flash then this area. You can see that's why this is all overexposed here by directing a flash, something I talk about and I teach in my Pro Interiors course. This allows you then to get a well-defined window without having to cut out all these little blinds. So for instance, what I can do is I can take that layer all the way up to the top, that flash layer. I can turn it then into darken mode. I can hide the layer mask by going layer mask hide. And then taking like a polygon lasso tool, I can just roughly anywhere draw around here and then hit Alt Delete on the keyboard and it's automatically there. I've got another window pull then for these windows over here, and I would do the same thing. I would take that all the way up to the top. I would turn that into darken mode, and then I'd do layer mask hide. And then I would just come in here and all I need to do is draw around the windows. So for instance, I would draw something like around this whole area here, and then down over here. And then I can also at the same time grab this other window, once again, just drawing roughly around it. Once I have those, I just go Alt Delete. That's it. The windows are there. So that's usually confused with doing flambient. But flambient and window pulls are separate. Yes, it's convenient to do these darken mode window pulls when you're doing flambient because you already got flash broke out. But when you're doing HDR, if you have a flash with you, then you should be doing your darken mode window pulls. It'll make life a lot easier. Let's go back here to this other example and see what I'm talking about. So first thing I did when I edited this is I made some other hue saturation adjustments. Very, very minor, just to get rid of some color casts, things I also show in the expert editing course. But here is my darken mode window pull. Now this, if it wasn't in darken mode, would look like this. You can see I just directed the flash directly at that window. But then once it was turned into darken mode and I masked in that window, that's it. That's all I had to do. I didn't have to try to worry about getting down here like by these chairs that have all this mesh on there and worrying about trying to get the view through there. No. A darken mode window pull takes care of that for you without having to cut that in. And the same goes, especially like when we saw this last example, when we've got these mini blinds. You don't have to worry about cutting that stuff in. Hit it with a flash, put it in darken mode. As long as you're exposing for the outside and you're not exceeding sync speed on your flash, then you can do this. And I haven't come across an instance yet where I couldn't do that. I've been doing this for a long time, and this is the best way to do it. Now the other trick to that is also take a repair layer, and if you notice here there's a little bit of haze on the window, so this is something else that I teach when I talk about doing darken mode window pulls, is you take a no flash window pull so that you can then cut in a few areas. You don't have to worry about though getting to the edge because that was already taken care of for you in the darken mode window pull. But once that's done, then there's just typical editing. I blacked out the TV, I added some color back into the table, and then I did some final adjustments here. and this was then the final image. So anyways, tip on that is to do darken mode window pulls no matter what. Doesn't matter if you're doing the high-end HDR technique or if you're using Flambient, do a darken mode window pull, your life will be a lot easier. The next tip is something that might sound obvious, but it's so often overlooked, and that's to just get it right in camera. If you're really relying on ambient shots to do your HDR blending, or if you're taking shortcuts with Flambient, well, you're gonna have a lot of work when you're up against something like this. This is an ambient shot, and this is what I call extreme light disparity, where out here in the dining room, well, it's completely blown out because it's such a high exposure compared to very, very dark here inside this kitchen. So this image right here is basically straight out of camera. And what I did was I had a speed light that I'm holding. I have another light, an 8200, that's over here bouncing off this portion of the ceiling. Then I've got another 8200 on a stand in this dining room. And I just keep adjusting the power on all of them until I see something that's coming out that looks pretty even, and then that's it. Now, yes, there's some ambient light missing. It's not quite as realistic, but it's better than the alternative. Trying to mess around with something like this in HDR or even Flambient is just not going to get you good results. So when you can, get it right in camera as close as possible when you're up against difficult areas like this, and it'll make your editing go a lot faster. The next tip that I found very useful is when it comes to editing things out or editing things in using either the eraser, brush, or remove tool. It's a technique that I call click release shift click. And the reason I've got this long name to it is because that's the order of the steps that you would be taking. So here we've got an example image of what I started out with was just this ambient shot here, and then an ambient shot here, and an ambient shot here that was cut in, as it looks like from these masks, to get these different exposures. Once again, this is a commercial property. Getting light to do this throughout this building was difficult, but they allowed me the time to edit and also shoot this, and it paid very well for it, so I took the time to do this. Also, this is a little bit easier to cut in, but this technique can work for very complex windows or other things you want to do. Once again, this isn't just for eraser and brush. You can also use this remove tool, so let's take a look at how this is done. So let's start fresh. This was once again the finished image with everything applied to it, but what we'll do, we'll shut all these layers off here and start with just this exposure, which is really for the outside. I had another one to darken this rooftop over here, but we won't worry about that for this example. So what I could do here above then this image, which is for the interior, and I was able to get by with just one single image, but if it was more complex, I'd have done the high-end HDR with two different exposures. But here, in any case, for this window, I can cut out those windows with like the pen tool or the polygon, but that can be very time consuming. There's a quicker way to do that. First, I'll add a layer mask, and I'll go up to the layer menu, layer, layer mask, and then hide all, which, by the way, you should learn as keyboard shortcuts. The less you move your mouse, the faster this will go. But anyways, that's where that stuff is, and I'll be talking a little bit more about keyboard shortcuts also coming up in the next tip. Right now, let's just go and do a hide all layer mask on that. Now, what I can do is take the polygon lasso tool right here, and I'm just gonna draw in very roughly where those windows are. And I'm not worried about cutting them in, because what I'm gonna do after that's selected, and after I fill that by doing Alt-Delete, now I can apply this new technique. So I'm gonna do Control-D to deselect it. Now I'm gonna zoom in really close here. I'll use the zoom tool, and we'll get in here fairly close. I could zoom in 100% if I'd like. Now what I wanna do is I wanna erase this off of here. So I'm going to select the eraser tool. So I've pressed E on my keyboard, I've got my eraser. And I want to change my flow up here and my opacity, make sure it's at 100%. So I'll just select the eraser tool and go then to 100% flow, 100% opacity. Okay. I can adjust the eraser or brush, whatever, to the size that I'm looking for here, but that can be hard to get exact, especially if you have some feathering. Most of the time for editing, you'll want a hardness of 0. That's a lot of feathering on a brush or eraser, but it really does a good job when you're talking about real estate photos. So to see where our overlap is going to be and really get a precise size, because if you're using your bracket keys, it's going to be bumping it up by about 10, 25, sometimes 100 pixels each time. So instead, here's the trick. This is the first part of this trick. The second part you're really going to love. The first part here is you want to use Control-Alt right click, or if you're on a Mac, it'll be Command Option right click. Not left click like normal, but right click on your mouse. So Control-Alt right click and you'll see a red dot. While you're still holding that, if I move back and forth left to right, you can see it's change in size. If I go up and down, you can see it change the hardness. So here I can change the amount of hardness and then the size that I want. So I get it to the exact size where I like it to be, and then I get it up here and so it's centered right over that beam right there. Then I'm going to do the first part of this second trick, and that's to do click release. So just do a left click with your mouse and release it. And then go down to the bottom of where it is you want to finish this off. We'll go down here and then hold down your Shift key and hit left click again. There. Now let's zoom out. You can see that took care of erasing that entire beam, and it did it very precisely. So I didn't have to try to use a polygon or pen or anything to do the opposite, which would have been to cut in the windows. Instead, I'm removing. Now the same thing could have been done with a polygon tool or a pen tool, but in this case it feathers it, and I control the amount of feathering with that trick that I showed, doing that Control-Alt and either the right click to the right left or right click up and down. Now things get a little trickier when you do this when there's another size, and that's when we're seeing perspective here. So in perspective, we've got a very large area here and a very small area here. One easy way to do this is in steps, and it's very easy though, is we'll start with the small end and work our way to the big end. So by selecting the eraser tool and doing our Control-Alt and then right click drag stuff here that we're seeing, just like we did before, we'll start out with this size, and then what we'll do is we'll do a click and go to the end over here near the top and do a Shift click. Got rid of that, and then I just need to take that same size and do a few more passes. You can see this is getting me a very accurate then line across here. I don't have to worry about too much about trying to get a straight line because these should be straight. If they're not, then of course it gets a little trickier. But I can do the same thing up here to just touch up those areas. So it's a little bit different, but still you've got a lot more control. And once again, this feathers that selection in a lot better than trying to use the pen or polygon tools. But one thing to be aware of is that after doing this and doing that Control-Alt-Click-Drag, what you're going to have is your hardness set different. Now you can go back up here and you can set your hardness just to 0. But another way to set your hardness to on a brush isn't just to use your bracket keys like I'm doing here to change the size of the brush. If you do Shift and the bracket keys, then that will change the hardness. So here I'm hitting the Shift and left bracket a whole bunch of times, because now I can see if I go up here, my hardness is set to 0. If I were to do Shift and my right bracket key a bunch, then if I go up here, you'll see that the hardness is then set to 100%. You want to reset it back to 0% when you do that technique. The other tip I want to talk about is using the proper keyboard shortcuts, and you can keep a cheat sheet nearby, but there's really going to be only a handful you'll probably ever use. And one of the best ways to see that is if you like a tool, if you use like the eraser a lot, you just hover over it. In this case, it shows that it is E. It's E for the eraser tool right here. If I were to then hover over, for instance, the clone tool, it's going to show me that it's S. S is assigned to that. And you can cycle through each one of these by just doing Shift in the letter. So for instance, in the eraser tool, if I were to left click and hold, you'll see there's different types of erasers. If I were to go up, for instance, over here to the brush, the healing brushes, there's different ones. There's the newest remove tool that came from Photoshop using AI to do the remove, and there's also different ones here. So what I can do, the shortcut for that is J. So what I can do is I can do Shift J, and each time I do Shift J, it cycles through each one of those tools until I get the one that I want. So that saves a lot of time than having to bring your mouse over here, left click, and then pick the one that you'd like to use. If you by chance don't happen to see some of those shortcuts here, you can also modify this menu. These three little dots here, right click on them, and you'll see this little thing, Edit Toolbar. And in there, that's when you can assign different things. You can see the Move tool is V, you can see the Marquee tool is M. If you didn't like something, you could click on that and you could assign what you'd like for its keyboard shortcut there as well. I'll just hit cancel and get out of here. But something also that's not really talked about too much, and that's automatically adjusting the flow of your brushes and eraser. And that, if you have, for instance, I've got the brush selected here, I could go up to the flow and I could drop it down and change the slider. Once again, that takes time. Instead, when you have a tool like brush eraser or remove tool selected, hold down Shift and press a number. Shift 8, change that to 80%. Shift 0, change it to 100%. Shift 3, changed it to 30%. Another real quick one too that I really like to use is navigating around by using the hand tool, but you don't have to select the hand tool from the menu, which would be over here. Instead, no matter what tool you're on, for instance, if I was using a brush, I'm brushing, hold down the space bar, you get the hand tool. As long as that space bar is pressed, I've got the hand tool to navigate around, so I don't have to keep going back and forth. I can get in here real close, hold down the space bar, and then move this around and see what other edits I might want to do. And then to be able to zoom all the way out or zoom to just 100%, it's Control 0 or Control 1. Control 0 or Command 0 if you're on a Mac, that's fit to screen, and then Control 1 or Command 1, that zooms you in 100%. Those type of things are also in the menu items. For instance, if we were to go up to the View menu, that's where you'd see how you can adjust zoom in and zoom out by using the plus or the minus keys with Control, but also then fit on screen, Control 0. 100% is Control 1. But an often overlooked one is to use F, and that is for full screen. If I hit F, I'm going to get this view. If I hit F again, I get this view, and I can do Control 0, and it fit that entire image to my screen. If I just press F again, I go back to where it was. Control 0 will fit it then in this window view. So you've got some similar things in Lightroom Classic, but there really aren't as many tools with shortcuts that really are needed. Once again, most of this work is going to be done with your presets, but if you press R, you'll get then the crop tool. And this is most useful in post-processing. So it's a keyboard shortcut I like to remember, and that's just simply R. If you do need to access the masking tool, that would be Shift W, and that just opens up then this masking tool. I really don't do a lot of masking in Lightroom Classic. I prefer to do that in Photoshop, but if you do, then Shift W will get you there. Now, Lightroom Classic has a lot more stuff on its real estate here. We've got the film strip on the bottom, these tabs off to the side. So similar to Photoshop, if you want to see full screen, you'd press F. And that's all you have to do here, and it is real full screen. You only have to press F once. And then I press F again, and it goes right back to the application. Just a couple other things real quick is that you shouldn't be applying a lot of your edits until you've done all of your image blending. Sure, there's lens corrections and a few pre-processing presets that you might apply, but you don't want to start changing things in the tonal range and curves and whatnot until you have done all your blending. Whether you're blending HDR images, whether you're doing Flambient, doesn't matter. Wait until the end. That'll really speed things up. Instead of futzing around with each individual image, each individual layer, blend those all together and then edit at the final end. That also goes for sharpening. That'll also just produce a better image with less chance of getting JPEG artifacts or other types of corruption from over sharpening. Another real big one too is to always edit on a solid state drive. Mechanical drives are just too slow when we're talking about photo editing today, especially with real estate photos where you're working on multiple layers. It's preferred to have a solid state drive inside your computer so that it's connected right to your computer's bus, but you could also use an external SSD drive if you need to. Those are just some of the tips, by the way, that I also talk about when it comes to speeding up Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. And once again, I have more of those videos for speeding up those applications down in the description of this video if you'd like to watch more.